Good evening, everyone. Good Vach, Shavua Tov. Too loud? I think that's my partner, Alan Gibber. He always complains I'm too loud. The topic of tonight's Klal Perspectives panel discussion is pressures, burdens, and expectations, the new family dynamic of the 21st century. Tonight's discussion is really the culmination of what has been a terrific Shabbos that was made possible with the help of a number of people. We had a magnificent meal in the shul with about 300 people showing up last night, followed by a discussion that was packed the sanctuary until about 11 p.m., and a drasha from Rabbi Lapiansky this morning, and another packed Shalosh Shudas and discussion this afternoon. I just want to thank the people who have really made this happen. First of all, Rabbi David Goldman, the managing editor of Klal Perspectives. Donnie Greenwald, Zevi Wallman, Yitzi and Nancy Pretter, Nathan and Beth Adler, and Gracie Rosenblum. But I just want to give a special acknowledgement. You know, anybody who attended the meal last night and the Shalosh Shudas today knows that it was really first class. And I want to just extend a real appreciation and acknowledgement to Nancy Pretter and Beth Adler. I think to Nancy and Beth, I think that the term satisfactory is not acceptable. So really amazing, but with such great meals comes great expense. First class is not cheap. So we'd also like to thank the weekend sponsors. It's Mort and Ari Fertel, Dr. Hal and Jody Crane in memory of David Ben David Ben Chaim, and Jerry and Soro Alaski in memory of Devorah Bas Avram Aaron. We'd also like to thank this evening's sponsor, the sponsor of tonight's panel discussion, Aaron and Debbie Gibber, in memory of Ruth Gibber, Rachel Basar of David Binyamin. So thank you very much for that. It's been a great privilege to host this Shabbos, so many special guests, and to have here for the panel discussion Rav Aaron Lapiansky, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Greater Washington, Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein, who's a senior member at the Wiesenthal Center. Rabbi Adlerstein actually just told me that next week he's going to be in the Vatican. So I guess Milan Bakodesh. And Jonathan Rosenblum. The goal for tonight's discussion should be to get him to remember that, or to forget that there's no mic here and no recording. I spent much of the day with him today, and he did not know. It proved quite fascinating. And in addition, we have our Murad Asar, Rabbi Hauer, who is our Rav here and made all of this happen, and Moshe Bain, who is involved with so many different organizations. The list of Jewish organizations he's involved with doesn't end, and I think it's no coincidence that he's a lawyer who specializes in bankruptcy. I think the two are tied together. I think if we had a slogan for this weekend, it would be "Feel the Bane." I thought it was. And finally, I think what's very important here, and one of the goals of Klal Perspectives, is to encourage as much participation and get as much that we can from everybody, that everybody can contribute and play a real role. So we want to invite people to participate. If you've been paying attention to the debates have been going on, each of the debate channels have been partnering with a 21st century media company or technology company to bring questions from the audience. YouTube, or Google or Facebook. With us, we're going to partner with Bic pens and index cards. So if you have a question, there are index cards around you, and Donnie and Yitzi may be going around handing them out. We'll collect them, and if we have time, we're going to try to get in as many questions as possible. We're going to try to give priority to those questions that are relevant to tonight's discussion. So without further ado, Moshe Bain.
Thank you so much. First of all, I have to express my appreciation on behalf of my wife and some of my children who are here for Shabbos for the warm greetings and hospitality that we've enjoyed in Baltimore. Many of you know I've spent many, many years in Baltimore, and for me, coming back to Baltimore, whether it's for an event such as this or for a simcha, is always a feeling of coming home to one degree or another, and the Shabbos has been incredibly exciting for us. People have been asking me how the sessions have been, and I told them I have no idea how much anybody else enjoyed it, but I've been having a great time, so this is wonderful. I think tonight's discussion is going to be a pretty broad-ranging discussion, all with one central theme, and that is being a frum individual in 21st century America is challenging. And different people have different challenges, but there's similar dimensions to that challenge, and the challenge tends to be the multiplicity of expectations and pressures that we all in our respective roles need to confront. Whether it's as a balabas, a leader of a family who has a parnasa obligation as well as many other competing for his attention, whether it's a woman balabasta who is trying to run a family very often simultaneously with running a career, and for students and for children whose expectations of them is perhaps the most daunting of all, primarily because they don't even have the background and preparation for it, and sometimes they don't even fully understand what the expectations and range of expectations are. And we'd like to spend some time tonight not just on identifying these challenges, because we all know these challenges, and it's not something we have to reiterate. They are all very close to our hearts and our experiences, but rather to spend an hour tonight trying to explore, so how do we deal with it? Now that we know that it exists and we acknowledge it, it's no longer a hidden secret that most of us are over our heads and a little bit out of control. Now that we admit that, it's like, the first step in the 12 steps. Now that we admit it, how do we deal with it? And I think that's the goal of the evening on a number of topics. I'm going to begin with a question to Rabbi Hauer, and it's really based on an article that he wrote in one of the more recent issues of Klal Perspectives, in which we addressed the challenges and experience of the Ben Torah Balabayas. And I want to quote some of the words of his beautiful afterword to that issue. And if those of you who have not had an opportunity to read that issue, I would very much encourage you to do so. And I quote, he first set up the topic, and he wrote as follows: "Life is challenging for everyone, so much to do, so little time. This is arguably even more of an issue in the complex world of the contemporary Balabayas, with a larger family and numerous religious obligations and goals. The struggle to meet the challenge can produce overwhelming guilt, stress, and exhaustion." And then Rabbi Hauer, you suggested as follows: should I really be trying to, in quote, do it all? You don't need to. You're not expected to. God does not expect any one of us to do it all. And then you went on to quote a series of Makoros, Chazals, each one conveying this message that you're really not expected to be Superman. That's not the expectation. And you concluded the following: each of these teachings, referencing the Makoros that were cited, assumes that any one person must find their task and master it to the exclusion of other worthy goals. Now that gives us all great comfort, but I think we need to get some more specific direction on what that means. What do you mean that I could give up some of the worthy goals? Meaning, you have a person who's trying to make a living and take care of their family, is trying to spend the requisite amount of time with their children, is trying to daven 3 times a day, is trying to learn a little bit, is trying to take care very often of elderly parents, and you're saying, well, you don't have to do it all. Well, what don't I have to do of those things? I don't know where I'm supposed to give up. If we're talking about someone who's running a building campaign for a yeshiva or is trying to learn 4 hours every night, I get it. But most of us are struggling with far less of a burden than that. So, Rabbi Hauer, how are we supposed to evaluate how to emphasize or de-emphasize part of our lives that all seem to be fundamental and necessary?
That is the most creative interpretation of Poschin B'chvod Achsanya that I ever heard. The premise of what I said there, and what I would say again here, is that a lot of the allotments of time that we're talking about come into the discretionary realm. Of course, there's no question that many times, many of us find ourselves in a situation that with absolutely no extra ambitions that are possible to trim from our agenda, we still can't manage it all. We still can't do it all. It's the way life is. We all sense, and I think today at Shalashudas, or you may have described that it wasn't always the way life was. You were describing the person coming home at 7 o'clock once upon a time versus the person coming home at 7 o'clock today. And once upon a time, he came home at 7 o'clock, and now he has time for himself. He has time to dedicate for Tzarchei Tzibur. Today is the extent of obligation which we have and how it chases us every place certainly makes things much, much more difficult. And I don't have any kind of a solution for the person who's going to be on the basic level filled, where every obligation, the most basic obligation, their basic work obligation to sustain their family, the basic amount of time cut in the sandwich generation between taking care of parents, taking care of children, being a decent spouse, being a decent husband. Life is full. Life is full, and these challenges are many. I think that to some degree, though, where we really find the stresses and the difficulties are going to be in the discretionary ambitions. Not survival, but people who feel like they could be, should be doing more. We look around and we see someone who is mechayev es. You know, the Talmud says you'd look at certain people and they would be mechayev, they would obligate. This one would be mechayev es ha'aniyim. This one would show that even if you don't have so many resources, this is what you can do. And we all look around at people, and whether it is professionally, with professional success, whether it is communally with communal involvement, familial success, involvement in Torah study, we imagine bars that we have to meet. We imagine that we have to be the masters of all. Survival is a challenge. I'm not trying to avoid the question. I think that is a reality. And then management skills of how we're supposed to be able to manage within those challenges remain. They remain, and those are skills that we have to learn. What primarily, though, we have to, I think, address is a person understanding their area of excellence. And it's not to look around at every possible area of endeavor and say, I must do that as well. We have the basics that every person has to do, and then the cheshbon hanefesh, the self-knowledge, to identify where we have to excel and where we have to seek out more.
Rabbi Lopiansky, if a person...
Guilty as accused.
Pardon me?
Guilty as accused.
If an individual has all of these competing burdens, and for many of us, the number one primary consumption of time is employment, it's working, it's making a living. And in today's world, the expectations of a family financially are enormous, the most of which, or the most prominent of which, is tuition obligations. But people who don't make enough money very often will get scholarships and get hanachos from the yeshivas. If a balabas would come to you and say, listen, it's too much, I don't want to work so hard, I'm finding it very difficult, is it okay if I just take it a little easy and I'll get paid, the community will pay part of my children's tuition? How much of an obligation do I have to view my responsibility to earn enough funds to pay for the tuition of my children, even if it creates stress on myself? Or am I able to say, hey, the community will take care of it, it really is a community obligation anyway, and I could have a more normal lifestyle? How do I weigh that as a balabas?
So it does sort of run into a halachic issue, I guess, of taking tzedakah. I could forget tuition, any type of tzedakah. I could work less hours and so on. Just as a rule of thumb, because we're not doing a halachic session, you would go between a person who wants to do less than is the accepted norm. Tzedakah itself allows you to have a normal lifestyle. You don't have to beggar, you don't have to be beneath the poverty line. So if a person is working to what we would consider to be 100% capacity, and he could do something extraordinarily pushing, so the person is entitled to take stock if he doesn't want to push himself all that much. If a person is sort of throttling back and saying, you know, I don't have to work a full day, I could work less, or, I mean, today a full day might be 10 hours. If a person is trying to go less than a normal communal norm, that would be wrong. To tell a person to do things that no one else does, it's a midas chasidus if he does it, but that at night after he comes home he should go around and sell pushkas or something from door to door to make the extra money, I don't think we can impose that, or we should impose that.
Rabbi Adlerstein, in your experience, I disagree. in your experience, have you observed the tension between people having to allocate time towards their children as opposed to time towards their personal learning? Is that one of the tensions that you observe with people in your community or elsewhere?
Are you in the habit of asking rhetorical questions? Of course, I think you were just trying to provide me with an opening which you're going to regret. The only thing that I have to add to this discussion is going to probably wipe out a good deal of the goodwill that I've tried to build up in the course of this weekend.
It hasn't been so much anyhow.
Well, there'll be even less now. We spoke last night about thinking strategically. I'm going to throw something out which is not going to be popular. But a lot of this pressure, probably the bulk of the pressure, is in making parnasa. A lot of that comes from maintaining a certain level of comfort. And the projection for the future is not any better than it is for us. This was not true of our parents, who thought that in every generation things are going to get a little easier. Things are probably going to get a little tougher. They're certainly not going to get easier. The whole climate, the professional climate, the business climate has changed in America. Maybe, just maybe, this is one of many, many different signals that the Ribono Shalom may be sending us, that the place for us to go, and if we're not ready for ourselves, at least to think of it for our children and our grandchildren, is Eretz Yisrael. It's the one place in the world where the standard of living is such that you have to work very hard, but it's not quite the same pressure as here. Tuition is not the same pressure. It could be that when we're talking about survival on the basic level, that the forecast is far, far, far better in Eretz Yisrael than it is here. And this is one of many, many different signals. Just open up papers and see what's happening to the power of Jews in America, to the declining influence, declining numbers, declining political situation, the moral climate in this country, the fact that the Constitution is now Olav HaShalom. There's just so many different indicators that at least we have to factor in that maybe what the Ribono Shalom is trying to tell us is that I created this wonderful bubble in America, as what Rav Chaim Volozhin has said, the last stop before Torah goes to America. And now it's time for us to go home.
We have here with us this evening Mrs. Lotta Press, who's a well-known educator of girls, high school girls, for many, many years in New York. And she has written for us in Klal Perspective. Some of you may recall her article. And I wondered if I could ask you, how are girls educated to expect their husbands, to what degree are they expecting their husbands to be helping at home or to be working long hours and learning at night? Like, what are girls being prepared for in a dynamic with their husbands in terms of their husbands' burdens?
In a family living class that I teach, I once did a board exercise in which I had the girls write down about how many hours a day their husbands were expected to do various tasks. And we gave them very, very little time for eating, and we gave them not very much time for davening, and we gave them time for job. And it was 26 and a half hours a day, every day. They don't have expectations. They're unrealistic, and they do want it all. And the reality, and they're not making these choices. They're not realistic. So that's one of the things that you're trying to do. Can I not answer your question and say, okay, thank you very much. I just want to say something very, very pragmatic in terms of how does one deal with this. The realities of women out there working, there's an assumption all the time that it's a kind of a liberal feminist agenda. It's not. You know that it's not. It's a part. That it is a little piece of that. It's a little piece of intelligent women using their talents. It's a little piece of. It's a lot of parnasa, and a lot of women in the frum community are doing it very well. When you see it not working well, it's certain people overburden themselves and stress themselves. There are a lot of women out there who are doing it very well. I would just like to address the simple question of how the community can help a little bit, how the community takes the reality of where we are today and helps it along a little bit. I know there's and I'm talking from Brooklyn. I don't know if other communities have the same level of tension, of busyness that Brooklyn does. But I'll give you a simple example. Mothers of young kids are constantly being called into the schools to participate in plays and projects and programs. You're visiting your child's school. You can be visiting your child's school on each grade level 3 times a year for this party and for this siyum and for this celebration. Is it necessary? One of the askanim in our school, in our community, worked very hard to reconcile the vacation days, the Hanukkah vacation days, and the intercession vacation days of boys and girls so that they would coincide, so that families could take children away. I have parents, I have a number of people who find it very painful, the amount of downtime between that schools are giving off too much time. My principal has gotten letters in which, and phone calls from parents who say, you can't keep on giving my child these days off because your teachers want these days off. I have nothing to do with the child. You're making my life a little bit more complicated. So I think that there are things that institutionally we can do. What we do in Prospect Park institutionally, we call meetings for 8 o'clock. We start at 8:02, and by 9 o'clock, everybody's out. When our school calls for parents to come in for a conversation, let's say 11th grade parents pre-college prep or whatever it is, or for a seminary conversation, those parents know. They know by now that if it's called for 8, by 8:02 we're talking, and by 9:05 the place is empty unless you still want to stay around. So I think that institutionally there's very pragmatic things, and then there are things that we can't help. A Miss Askin list comes out every day. It hits my house every single day. And guess what? I'm going to Nichum Avelim in a way that I hadn't. Now, it's true, at my age, there are more cases of Nichum. There are more people to visit. But all of a sudden, people that, what shall I say, the psychic responsibility to be Menachem Avel is there. I wouldn't have known about these cases. I know a friend of mine who doesn't invite anyone from out of borough, doesn't inform anyone out of borough of an engagement of a child or a l'chaim or a vart. She says, if you live within 5 blocks of my house and you can stop and easily come, otherwise, and she's had friends who said to her, why didn't you let us know? You let us know a week later. And the answer is, I think everything I'm saying here is, given that everything you're talking about, these are big and these are heavy and they're not going away, what can we do in terms of our choices and our decisions and areas of our authority to just constantly recognize how primary it is for us to reduce the burdens on people?
Thank you. Please, Rabbi Heller.
Yeah, I just, if I may, to speak of the tuition question which you posed to Rabbi Lopiansky, about the family, the person who's working hard wants to, quote unquote, take it easy to be able to not struggle to pay the full tuition. Phrased that way, that certainly it doesn't sound right. But fundamentally, when we speak about community and tuition and the responsibility of a community to establish schools, I don't think that the result of that is for a parent taking a tuition reduction to see themselves as receiving tzedakah. The system which was established by Chazal of how this works is that there's supposed to be a public school. There's supposed to be a public school for the Jewish people. And yes, there's some kind of a formula of a mix between what the consumer pays and what the community chips in, but the understanding was that it was a responsibility of the community, Takanas Yeshua ben Gamla, however you want to trace it, to make sure that children will be able to get an education. And the communal provision of that does not make the individual who takes advantage of it rightfully and appropriately a beneficiary of tzedakah, any more than coming to a shul, if you didn't build it, makes you a beneficiary of communal tzedakah. We work together as community to create infrastructure that everybody should benefit from. And more importantly and fundamentally, the stress of family may, in order to be able to pay all the tuition right now, in a way which causes parents to be unable to be there for their children, has tremendous hidden costs, which will be revealed very, very shortly. A parent who's investing energy and time in raising healthy children, in being able to be there for their children, is providing the community with a great service. They're investing with Mesiras Nefesh to make sure that they have a family, and the family is raised properly, and we have a healthy and strong Jewish community. I'm a congregational rabbi. I get many situations where people come to ask questions about family planning. Family planning is a very serious halachic question. It's not one to discuss easily here, but sometimes people will pose the question of family planning the way you posed the question, which is, well, if we choose to have more children, it's going to be hard for me to be able to pay full tuition. And that argument, I think, is one which is ignoring the tremendous contribution to the community that a family that's going to bring healthy, strong children into the Jewish community does. It's not something to be ashamed of for a person to take a tuition reduction. If they're goofing off, if they're taking a tuition reduction so that they can live in a $500,000 home, I know that sounds strange to the New Yorkers. But if they're taking a tuition reduction so that they can live and take vacations and so on and so forth, but a person who's living responsibly and doing the right thing and wanting to raise a family and be there for their children and for their family and to be able to produce a fine, healthy family, that's what communal education structures are for. And for people to feel that they're receiving tzedakah as a result, I think is not appropriate.
Now that Ramesh answered my question, I'll answer his question, return him in kind. I think there is a deeper basis for the question that we didn't explore, and that is demands and stress are two separate things. Demands, I can give you an example. We all get hundreds of letters soliciting tzedakah. I doubt very many of us are stressed out by it. Maybe the stress is taken down to the garbage can or something, but we don't feel terribly. So stress is really a reaction that someone else is taking control of your life. The Brisker Rav was one of the most focused over the Hashem. And during the war, in the beginning of the war, there was bombing in Warsaw. He was in Warsaw at the beginning of the war. And there was a terrible predicament if it's safer to stay in a house because it offered some sort of protection against the bomb. But on the other hand, the Germans were bombing houses, not Jews, they just bombing houses. Whereas in the field, there was no protection, but the Germans weren't particularly, dropping bombs there. And it was a question of life and death, and the Brisker Rav was in excruciating pain and stress. And then the bombing, so at the end he said, I don't have a decision. Shaval Taisa Adek, wherever you are when the bombing starts, stay there. Don't do anything proactively. The bombing started and people's nerves were shot and they were stressed out, and the Brisker was very calm. And someone said to me, I don't understand, yesterday you were Eismensch, you couldn't sit still a minute, you were agonizing, and today you're calm. He said, as long as I had the responsibility to make a decision, that's a decision of life and death that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has placed on me, and I have to try to execute it. When it's not in my hand anymore, then it's Hashem. I trust HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and if HaKadosh Baruch Hu deems my life should be taken, that's that. I think first thing is to understand that the real issue is doing what's right. And the things that we can't do, we're not meant to do. Yes, it's sometimes a difficult decision and it needs to be spoken over with somebody which to prioritize. But the things that you can't do, you never were meant to do. So just like somebody who's sick and your kippah comes round, to feel stressed because he's not fasting a kippah, he wasn't meant to fast in kippah. So I think the first thing we need to decouple our sense of guilt, and we need to feel guilt when we're guilty. One. Two, it requires getting control over it, and is Musa taught that a person needs some time, and because we have such a crazy schedule, what happens is we're being torn. If a person would have time to be mizbonin once a week, 15 minutes of quiet time with nobody around him, and he would sit down and list all the things he needs to do and ask himself rationally, is this because of pressure? Is this because I think it's obligation? Is this because I'd like to do it? Let's make a seder. If I have a shayla, let me speak to somebody who understands me and can help me solve it. But those two items, understanding that we should be pressured to decide what to do, but never stressed by not doing what we can't do. And we need to have a control panel, which is a quarter of an hour a week of quiet time, private time, where we simply list what's going on and what do we really think our priorities are. And if need be, when there's one particular shayla, to ask that.
Thank you. I want to go move on to a related but distinct question. Rabbi Rosenblum, you're likely the most accomplished recorder of the broadest range of Gedolim in the past recent generation, as we've spoken earlier. You've studied and observed the lives of many Gedolim, many living in different locations and taking different approaches in their avodas Hashem. In that context, it would be very helpful to get your view on a thesis presented in one of the articles in the recent issue of Klal Perspectives on the Ben Torah Balabayas. A leading pulpit rabbi, in his article addressing those challenges, who actually learned in Litvish yeshivas throughout his career, suggested that our yeshiva system errs in emphasizing gadlus. The term he used was that there is a significant, in quote, cost of striving for greatness. He lamented the message being conveyed to Bachram as follows, and I quote, "The Bachar is taught that it is not one's innate intelligence or skills that deem one qualified for Torah greatness, since many have accomplished this feat with far lesser qualifications. Hard work and commitment are all that is required to achieve objective and observable greatness. The message, of course, is that if one fails to evolve into a gadol, there is no one to blame but oneself." And the author went on to explain that therefore we should deviate from this focus on gadlus to rather teach our students that all they need to do is to be as good as they could be and be erliche yidden, and that is more than anybody could expect. I have a couple of questions for you. First question, is the premise of this writing accurate? Is it fair to suggest that the Gedolim of the past were successful in reaching their heights by virtue only of their hard work and commitment? Is that message flawed in its essence? Or did most, if not all, possess particular gifts, whether genetically or in circumstances, that were essential to their achieving what they achieved?
I would say that intelligence is neither a absolutely necessary condition, and it's certainly not a sufficient condition. In no case, they once came up to Rav Gusman, and somebody came up to him and said that, you're such an Eloi. Rav Gusman was a physically powerful man, and he grabbed this person by the throat and lifted it up, and he said, "This has nothing to do with being an Eloi. This has to do with hard work." So there is, the message is not completely false that there were, Rav Noach Weinberg, about whom I'm completing a biography right now, who probably pushed people to the absolute limits harder than anybody else, used to tell the story of Rav Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and asked a series of questions on the whole story of why was he plowing in the field if his father was so rich? Why did he get sent by Eliyahu Navi to Yerushalayim if in fact, to learn by Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai? Couldn't somebody else have taught him Kriyat Shema? And why in his mid-20s did Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai take one look at him and say, "Have you learned Kriyat Shema?" His father was one of the known Gedolim of this time. And the answer to all these questions is that he was obviously, in some sense, looking mentally defective. That's how Rav Noach touched it up. And it's pretty compelling with his set of questions. And then answer was, and yet, because he cried over this and sought so much to learn that he became the teacher of the Gadol Ador and the teacher of Rabbi Akiva and so forth, it's not terrible to teach kids that their intelligence is not the limitation. There's a lot of mistakes in education. Gifted children are often disadvantaged by the fact that they're not taught to work hard when they're young. They can be disadvantaged in yeshivas by their very gifts. What comes easy to them at an initial stage, there's nobody at some point in their learning that Gemara doesn't come hard to them. But there's a second point. There is a second point here. Is it realistic to tell everybody, therefore, you're a failure if you don't become a gadol? And I don't think that's the case either. Of course, my first biography was Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was preeminently normal. And, he held out the goal that he used to say everybody should learn for at least 2 years after the chasana, so that the house should be put on a basis of a house of Torah learning. That wasn't the ethos of Torah Vodas in his time. It certainly wasn't the ethos of Torah Vodas in Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich's time. I mean, the yeshiva broke apart in a bitter dispute because there was one brilliant young man, Rav Shraga, whose father took him into the family business at 19, who Rav David Leibovitz saw as a future gadol. And Rav Shraga Feivel said, I'm trying to produce Balabatim. I'm trying to produce B'nai Torah who are armed with what they need to succeed in this world. And that wasn't the goal at that time, that everybody should achieve godless. It's frequently quoted in the yeshivas that Elef Nichnasim ve'echad Yotzei Lehorah. Now, this is a misquotation of the Midrash in any event, but to the extent that it's quoted, it assumes that one person that it's 1 in 1,000. It's not everybody is going to become a gadol. Everybody is a failure if they don't become a gadol. It's understood that that type of godless, the echad yotzei lehorah, is a concatenation of events, whether it's some natural talents. There definitely were gedolim in the Mir Yeshiva. One of the great, Rav Nosson Tzvi's teacher, was known as somebody who was simply not bright as a child. He used to sit learning in the yeshiva. He used to sit and learn in the yeshiva on Purim, and the other Bachrim, they would tease him, and they'd say, you have such a dead head. What is the point? At least enjoy Purim. You can't enjoy anything else. And they would tease him, and he became really one of the great Torah scholars. Rav Asher Weiss said to me the other day, he said, one of the great poskim of the generation, he said, it's a good thing he went to Kollel because he wasn't suited to Lamdas. He's not a Lamdan. But when he came into the Indian of Halacha, the message that everybody has to be a gadol or you're a failure is a mistaken message, and it's not supported but the idea that you don't set yourself the limits. Don't make it too easy on yourself that the limits that, I wasn't born smart and therefore I can't be.
I'm getting a mixed message.
Yeah.
So could you please clarify? If you can't, I'll ask somebody else to.
Okay, go ahead.
Yitzchak, how do you view that? I mean, on one hand, the suggestion is anyone could become a gadol. All you have to do is work hard. On the other hand, you shouldn't tell everyone you have to be a gadol. What should our children be subject to in pressure? Should they be given the easy out, or they should be told, hey, if you'd be put together, you'd make it?
As in most difficult questions in life, it's both complicated, and the key is to find the right balance. I think what Jonathan was saying is that you don't want to withhold from people the possibility of setting the bar higher than they initially set it, to give them the confidence that if they really, really want to shoot for the stars, they should be able to, and we should be there encouraging them and helping them along. At the same time, we've seen the devastating consequences of one size fits all, of telling everybody that they have to be a gadol, and if they're not, it's their own fault. We have to find a model in which there are other roles for people, in which they know that there's something beautiful to being a professional or a balabas, that a person is mefarnes isho vanav, is an oset tzedakah tamid, that there are lots of roles that as Jonathan showed me today a beautiful hesped for someone we both knew very, very well, Rav Meir Schuster Zatzal, that the key was not striving for godless, but for being an Eved Hashem. And there are many, many different ways of being an Eved Hashem. The person who gets turned on at an early age to wanting to become a gadol, ein davar omed b'fnei haratzon, even though it's not a chazal and nobody still figured out where it comes from. Maybe Herzl, but but there still is an amount. There still is some truth to it. You don't have to be the genius. You don't have to be the child prodigy, although it does help b'derech klal. At the same time, we have to give a message loud and clear that there are other ways for people to make their contribution, that the Ribbon Shalom will love them not an iota less.
I'd just like to point out the Mesilas Yesharim at the very end. The very last thing that the Mesilas Yesharim says is that you can be a chassid, that a person who is a pashut person can be a chassid just as much as a person is a great Talmid Chacham. It's interesting that the Mesilas Yesharim at the end of all the ladders, I may not be quoting it exactly, and will be happy to defer to a correct quotation, but the Mesilas Yesharim at the end points out that the highest level of a Chassidus is something that is accessible, and he doesn't make it contingent purely on your level of Torah learning. I mean, he explicitly excludes that conclusion.
I don't know what's so bad about telling people that they should strive for godless. I mean, if they're supposed to strive to have Jonathan Rosenblum write a book about them, that would be perhaps a mixed message. If godless means specifically...
People, so it's not a thing to strive for.
It's fine. I'm not even going to respond.
I want to explain one thing here. I was a little bit badly behaved last night, and now, luckily, we can be taped, so I was badly behaved. If you look at this and you have an IQ test, which person doesn't fit on this panel? So why would you say I don't fit on this panel? I'm the only one whose wife is not here, which means that impulse control is a little bit limited. In honor of Justice Scalia, he said, they say that marriage is a freedom of expression. Anybody who's been in this happy state for long enough knows that it's a limitation on the freedom of expression. So I'm putter from that limitation. Okay, just...
Last night.
Sorry.
I assume I'm not fresh on the article, which I certainly read in its time. But there certainly is sometimes a concern that in certain systems, people maybe are taught that the only path is to find your greatness in Torah study. And, we've talked about it over Shabbos and beyond, and obviously there are reasons why the system is constructed that way, and there has to be some balance which is provided one way or the other, inside or outside the system, to address that. But having people strive for greatness, to do things like really, really well, to strive for godless, I think that's a message which we should be trying to strengthen. I don't think we have really enough of that. I don't think we have enough of that. I think with the level of sometimes the combination of coddling, the combination of not having young people set ambitions for themselves, but just sort of like putting them on an assembly line of what their educational system is supposed to look like, and not having them as individuals construct some level of goal and ambition for themselves. I think that's the failing. The failing is perhaps an absence of a chinuch for godless.
So we have on one hand the thesis that anyone could be a gadol if they only worked hard enough. By the same token, you can't really encourage people to understand they need to be a gadol, and then Rabbi Hauer suggests, but everybody should have godless, and the fact that it creates pressure is something that, if anything, is helpful, not difficult. I note that here we have here this evening Dr. Weisbord, who perhaps has a unique capacity to give us guidance, having grown up in a world of godless, but by the same token being a mental health professional, is being in an environment where godless is an expectation a healthy thing, as Rabbi Hauer seems to suggest that godless should be, and if anything, is underachieved and under-encouraged, or is it something that represents a danger to a child and a student?
Thank you.
I'm here for you, doctor.
I suspect that none of the Gedolim any of us knew, know, wrote about, read about, none of them woke up one day and said, I am going to be a Gadol. I think they came to it, they grew into it. What Rabbi Hauer said about a standard of godless is in menschlichkeit and in avodas Hashem. I just don't believe Gedolim said, I'm going to be a Gadol. That's not what it was about. And I think that is the bottom line of the mistake that we're making with this door. We're talking about become a Gadol, or nothing. Those are the two alternatives. Become a mensch and do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from you. I can't imagine. My Zaidi Zatzal told me many stories about when he was a child, and he knew that he had an unusual brain, but he never said anything that someone told him to be a Gadol. He was supposed to learn.
Not send letters, intercept letters that were sent to him so he wouldn't be taken away from learning when the house burned down. I mean, there
It
were...
was when his father died.
Yeah, right, okay.
And he didn't tell him for a year.
Right, so there was...
But it wasn't because he said to Rav Ruderman, you have to be a Gadol. The assignment was he was supposed to finish Shas. And the Alter, okay.
I rest my case.
How old was he at the time?
17.
Okay.
But he had
No pressure.
it wasn't pressure for him. He had a photographic memory. But the Alter had the wisdom to see that he would be knocked off his base and he would be so fatumot, he would not complete that. And he knew, it's no coincidence the Talmidim of the Alter are responsible for what, 80, 90% of the yeshivas that are here, because he dealt with each one as an individual. There was not this motto in the Slobodka Yeshiva that said, thou shalt become a Gadol. That's all I want to say.
Right, thank you.
I think we're using, one of the issues when you use a word indiscriminately, the word Gadol, the way it's being used is I guess, self-contradictory. If a Gadol means the greatest person in generation, there can only be one. So you're always setting up a 99.9% failure. If you're talking about Gadol as a dimension, a person in Slobodka, which my father was Slobodka, and he learned there for Tkufa. Gadol was a certain description of a big-minded person versus a small-minded, a person who knew a lot, a person who knew little, a person who had clear understanding versus a person who had muddled understanding, and certainly personality-wise, a big person was big, a small person was petty. And everyone should become a Gadol. Well, we all start as Ketanim, halachically, and we hopefully move on to Gadlus. Gadlus is a quality, and I think it's important that kids should have a goal to look up to, but that goal can't be, I don't know if the word is zero-sum for this, it's basically, you want to be the best, so that's a goal for one kid. Secondly, it also has in itself the Jonathan writing the biography about you. I once met a friend of mine, I said, Nachum, I haven't seen you in a while. He says, I've noticed in all Gedolim books, there's a part in their lives when they disappear for a while. And I'm filling in that chapter. So, it's down deep. down deep, because you research what they did when they went away. He has but down deep, it's wanting to have a picture of me as a nister. If it's a personal quality, I want to tell you, you mentioned Chaim Kamil, and he was somebody that I was close to. He was an extraordinary paradigm. What happened was, his speed of grasp was limited, but he didn't become like this overnight genius because he learned so much. His learning was methodical, careful. He was happy with himself. He wasn't looking, he didn't have an inferiority complex, an superiority complex. He learned glatt. Everything about him was glatt. When you spoke to him in learning, It was amazing. Some big Elohim would come to him, they'd start doing all the pace, and he would say, minut. I can't go so quickly. Start with point 1. And the poor guy would have to do point 1. Now the next point. I don't get how that follows. It tells no, slower. And by the time you got to third or fourth point, you lost a lot of connections, and you realized it. And that was how he thought, and the pashtus and the yashrus was him, and we spoke to him everything. So, godless is a very important goal. Slabodka was built on godless. But godless didn't mean the best. It meant bringing out a dimension, and a mashgiach gave you an intuitive sense of when you're acting petty, when you're showing signs of godless, and when you're a godless-like a person. You had models, but many models, role models. Reb Chaim Kamil was a role model in the Meir Yeshiva. Reb Nachum was an off-the-chart genius. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz was an off-the-chart genius. Reb Chaim Kamil had qualities of yashrus, qualities of being methodical, qualities of being happy and balanced, no hang-ups in either direction. So I think just giving a much different definition of what we mean by godless would resolve a lot of this back and forth, I think.
Right. Okay, I'd like to touch on one last point, and then we'll entertain some of the questions that were collected from the Olam here. Rabbi Adlerstein, in one of the earlier issues of Klal Perspectives, we explored the impact on the Jewish family of women working outside of the home. It was fairly broadly acknowledged by almost all of the articles that the vast majority of families today view 2 incomes as a necessity, not an indulgence of women too restless to be home and care for children, or an aspiration for luxury. There were a wide range of views as to the impact of the new norm, which is a 2-income family. And I want to quote a number of the articles before I get your impression. One leading women educator wrote the following: unique ability of the wife and mother to actualize the potential of the husband and children is impacted. Again, we're not speaking about giving Sarala piano lessons to actualize the budding wunderkind, but rather gearing a woman to use her multifaceted intelligence and talents to cultivate the character of Sarala so she will have the tools to become an Ovedes Hashem. This cannot be accomplished by a babysitter. And the implication was that when mothers are working, the child is suffering dramatically as a result. A well-known Rebbitzin and educator wrote the following: I spend a lot of time with young, working, observant women. They are overwhelmed, and I worry that they and their children are paying a price, and that their husbands are paying a price. Together as a community, we must find a way to restore a balance that will create healthy households, even in this very complicated time. And one last article I want to quote. It was an article written by 2 eminent women who are mental health professionals, and they introduced us to this character, Naomi, and the impact of her new role as a working woman on her marriage. And they wrote as follows: Naomi, a mother of 6, described a transition in her relationship with her husband. I think, now she's being quoted, I think up until now, I was like a worker. I don't mean a worker getting paid, but I was like the wife taking care of the kids. Now that I have additional roles outside of the home, his view of me is that she's her own person. She has a goal in life. It has somewhat equalized our relationship. For Naomi, the writers write, this new respect and responsibility came with challenges. She explained that since she began attending school, her husband feels gypped. Now, Rabbi Adlerstein, probably of the members of the editorial board, you probably have a greater interaction with the broadest range of Orthodox Jews around North America. And we'll turn in a moment to people who are probably more qualified, the women who we've been consulting with this evening. But from your experience, what has been the impact on the mother-child relationship? What has been the impact on the family? What has been the impact on the marital dynamic within the Orthodox community of this new reality of dual incomes and dual workforces? And is it a good thing? Are we improving relationships and mutual respect? Are we diminishing it? And how can we do it? What can we do to make it as good and as effective and as blossoming a product as possible?
Well, to begin with, just backtracking a little bit, as an Angelino, I'm puzzled about your comment before about $500,000 houses. If you can show me a place to get a $500,000 house, I'll take 3. B, in all seriousness, I think we're beyond talking about 2 incomes per family. Besides the joke about why we have to undo the Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom because no person can live on the income of one wife.
Or one sphere.
Or one shver. In all seriousness, many, if not most of the families that I know of are talking about 2+ incomes. It means a full-time job and a couple of half-time jobs. We're talking well beyond that in many cases. I think it's too early without deferring to Jonathan's suggestion before, which really should not be undervalued, which is we just don't know in many cases without doing the research. Almost everything that we have today is anecdotal, and you've just given a good example of it. You're getting different reactions. On the one hand, there are people talking about enormous stress. On the other hand, there are people who are saying that I buy into this quality thing. I trained for the kind of job where I would be available maximally to my kids. I got the right credential, the right degree. I was makbid to be there when the kids come home or within a reasonable time after. And I can't say it's perfect, and I don't know if the way my mother raised us was any better. But that's the reality of things. At the same time, as a woman, dealing with all the pressures of changing roles in secular society for women, some of which, consciously or subconsciously, I am buying into. I do look at myself differently when the talents that I know that I have and the creativity that I know that I have are being put into something that's giving me more satisfaction than the role that my mother had as a secretary. I can do more, and I would be very disappointed with myself if I weren't using some of those talents. Now, not everybody has that tendency or that feeling or even the talent. We are not going to know the answer to that without getting some more hard data. I do sense that many people out there do buy the idea of quality time, both for mothers and for children. I can't believe it'll ever be as good as 100% staying home full-time mommies, but a lot of those full-time mommies we know in some areas are not doing such a great job with their time management and frittering away their time with things that make them lesser people. In communities where people are simply makbid that their wives be, in some case, trophy wives and not have anything out of the house, and as long as there's some other prices to pay, which we're not going to detail, I'm not sure that they make better mothers. I think this is part of the confusion, but that we can't eliminate the possibility that women have found in our community a balance between the need to bring in some extra income without seriously compromising the chinuch that they're giving to their children.
Among the guests we have here this evening is Dr. Dubin, who's a mental health professional here in this community. I was wondering if you could observe for us what kind of behaviors, dynamics could be introduced in order to make marriage enhanced by a dual income family rather than suffer as was suggested might occur.
Thank you. So I think that one of the things we've talked about is people using their talents to best serve the kehillah in whatever way. And Rabbi Harris spoke about excellence and people striving for excellence. And I think for different people, that attempt to reach excellence comes in different ways. And I don't think one size fits all, that we can say that every woman is going to be home and that's going to be the best place for her, or every woman is going to be out working. I think it's about balance and about each person looking at their individual characteristics and how they can best use it. We talked about, Rabbi Rosenberg mentioned about anecdotes. There is some data out, and the data suggests that women who are working and are satisfied and happy to be working are happier mothers, and women who are home full-time and happy about being home full-time are happier mothers. The women who are working who really don't want to be working, or the women who are home and really don't want to be home, are the less satisfied parents. I think that you have to, in some ways, address each person's ability. Now, having said that, we talked about the tuition responsibility, we talked about the $500,000 homes and all the financial burdens on people. People have to investigate that and find a balance. In listening to what we were talking today, I think some of it is also about the messages we give each other. I think that sometimes if we would communicate with each other in a more kindly, less judgmental fashion. We have all the mommy wars and all, so the mommies at home are the best, so the mommies who are working are doing the best, and the mommies at home aren't doing enough. If we could have some kindness and compassion rather than competitiveness towards each other, I think as parents, we could all do a better job. A really telling example of this, I had a woman come into my office many years ago and changing the details, and she's like, oh, I'm such a failure as a mother. My next-door neighbor, her house is immaculate. Dinner is ready and perfect on the table when her husband walks in. Her sheitel is always perfect. Everything is so put together. My house is always flying. It's a mess. My husband walks in. Dinner isn't always ready. I wish I could be more like her and be more organized instead of sitting on the floor and playing with my kids. An hour later, a woman walks in and says, I'm so jealous of my neighbor. She's got her priorities straight. Instead of always worrying about her house being spotless and her sheitel being perfect and dinner being ready when her husband walks in, she's down on the floor playing with her children, and she gives them so much love and so much attention. And I look back at my little face sheet, and they're next door neighbors. And neither one has shared with each other how they're feeling so competitive about and each person has to look at their strengths. And certainly this is straight about Reb Zusha and talking about being the best Reb Zusha you could be. I want to take it in our community. Rabbi Binyamin Steinberg, Alav Hashem, was a very beloved machanech. I had the privilege, and certainly in the whole Welt, we have a respect for Rabbi Stern. He taught me an important lesson about this. When I was in 10th grade, as only a 10th grader maybe could do, I said, you know what? I'm going to study the 13 midas of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. I'll take one midah a week, and in 13 weeks, I'll be perfect. So he talked about striving for godless. So I started week 1 with shtika. That was a good midah. So by day 2 of my working on shtika, everybody I knew thought I was mad at them because I wasn't talking. And I went literally in tears to Rabbi Steinberg's office, and I was like, I don't know what's wrong. I'm trying to be just like Rabbi Salanter, and everybody's mad at me. He said, the mistake that you made was saying that the 13 midas that Rabbi Salanter said he had to work on to achieve his improvement is not the same 13 midas that you need to work on. You need to look at yourself and your abilities and your talents and think, what the Hisbodedus, the Rabbi Lopiansky spoke, that you look at yourself and say, what are the abilities that I bring to the plate? And I think it's the same way when we look at the working parents. Which mothers are going to be able to function better in their roles going out? Which parents are going to function? Which parents can juggle better? Which families are set up in such a way that there's going to be more support from a grandmother, from a husband, from a sibling? So I don't think there's one size fits all, but I think that every parent, whether they're the father or the mother, has to have this idea that my children and my family come first. I'm doing all these other things because they're important, or I can contribute in a meaningful fashion, but at the end of the day, it's about my family, my Torah, and my life.
One more question, I'll come. In the issue on this topic, Mrs. Press wrote a piece, and the impression that the article left was a comment that in all of your years of being an educator, you were not able to perceive a identifiable distinction in children whose mothers work and don't work. Was that a misunderstanding? If it was accurate, then are you telling mothers who are prepared or willing or say that they understand it as a Mesiras Nefesh to give up their careers to be home with their children, that it's really silly because you're not going to make any difference anyway in being home with your children?
I'm not willing to draw any such conclusions. I only told you what I saw. And I don't, I mean, I could hypothesize in a lot of different directions. I have no proof, no basis, no anything else. I'm just telling you that over the years I probably saw well over 3,000 girls. And I am seeing them at the high school level. That means that there are mothers who probably were home when their children were younger and no longer, and went out later. But the reality of my impressions is the reality of my impressions, and other people that I've talked to have shared those realities. I can't make it. I can't come to any conclusions based on that.
Great, thank you.
I at a Torah Masora convention once when I said this, and a woman came over to me later, very, very pained. She said she thought she had made sacrifices, just as you said it, and that I seem to have been denigrating, a life of sacrifice. I was very sad, but I don't intend to, turn this into anything more than just an observation.
Thank you.
Wouldn't it be hard to believe? I travel widely, and I'm too cheap to stay in hotels, so I'm in a lot of families. And I mean, it depends on the arrangements the family can make, but it would be a pretty disastrous condemnation if it were really true that a child who is left with a nanny for 8 hours a day comes out as good a Jewish child as one who has the benefit of their own parent. I mean, the circumstances under which it would, the arrangements would depend a great deal here, I would think. I mean, it seems wildly just counterintuitive to say that frequently a non-Jewish caretaker for a huge number of hours a day could possibly do as well as the child's natural parent. I'm just saying what's intuitive, I'm not contradicting Dr. Press's observations, but and I do see a difference in my travels. I do see a difference between children who are raised out-of-town communities where it's more common for women not to work. There are discernible differences, at least in my opinion there are, but of course if the mother's going to be embittered by being at home, or the mother says, I'll go crazy if I'm here all day, that's a different story. A mother who feels embittered, feels she's missing out on something, then her staying home is not going to be an advantage to anybody.
Rabbi Hauer, you wanted to weigh in on this discussion?
I did. I'm trying to decide if I still want to. All the points that have been made here are, of course, significant. There are many, many examples of women who have chosen to be involved in a profession as an expression not just of financial need, but as expression of their personal use of their kochos and their satisfaction. I think it's something which goes back earlier than contemporary times. And yes, that's the case. I think that we are dealing in a time where focus on family and the quality of attention on family is significantly suffering. And we have seen families suffer. I don't have data. I just have, the, so to speak, anecdotal experience, which it seems to me like that everyone, Rabbi Goldberger, how do you think the family is doing relative to 20 years ago? Children, attention from parents, how do you feel? Worse. Okay, thank you. Rabbi Goldberger is the only other rabbi who would say that. We don't have data. We don't have data, but we have it. And someone said, I don't remember who said this before, but people frittering away, maybe it was Rav Yitzchak, people frittering away their opportunities. We don't necessarily have it as a clearly defined goal that children need the focus and attention of parents as being the center of their lives. If parents can spend time when their children are home and awake, talking on the phone with friends, even when walking down the street with a baby, we're not understanding what a child needs. And what Mrs. Press talked before about balancing, all for schools being very sensitive to the parents' schedules and everything else. But a child, when their parent comes to a school event, they live for it for 3 weeks before, and they live off of it for 3 weeks afterwards. It's, my kids are so excited when they're looking forward to something. They're going to go and they're all going to play their flutes off key for 15 minutes together. By the way, they do it much, much better now. But my mother, my father, if he's allowed to, because I'm under the age of 6, right? they're going to come and they're going to watch. They're going to be there. Are you going to be there on time? Are you going to be there at 10 o'clock in the morning when it's supposed to? Those are moments that are incredibly, incredibly valuable, and I don't know that we would want to minimize them. Now again, there's balancing realities. I'm not trying to challenge it, but we are suffering. Our families are now. They're challenged by needs which can't be changed, of parnasa and everything else, and the focus on the fact that there is a sacrifice, that we are losing because of it, that we have just different realities in terms of what children grow up, in terms of the secure system and the sense of focus and attention around them. I don't think it would be a service for us to say that nothing has changed.
There's another way of looking at this question as kind of a complement to it, which I think we've ignored, and it would not be good for us to leave this session without thinking of it in slightly different terms. Around 10 years ago, a massive Talmud Chacham in Lakewood, a good friend of mine, Rav Yaakov Yosef Reinman, wrote a book which soon gained notoriety as a dialogue with a Reform rabbi, Amiel Hirsch. It became a bit of a bestseller, and it provided him with an opportunity as an entree into the houses and hearts of lots of people outside the Orthodox community. It had a tragic end, which we won't talk about, but people who read the book, many of them, myself included, believed that he won every single argument in the book except one. He came out short on the women's issue. And that wasn't because of any problem with his thinking. He's brilliant. He's also Rav Matisyahu's Chavrusa. But it's because we haven't really worked things out. We don't really have it figured out exactly what the role is for women. There is a bigger role for women, as Rav Yitzchak Arama points out in the Kedas Yitzchak, about why Yaakov got so angry at his wife when she said, Tein li banim, if not, Mesa anochi. And he says, before Chava was Chava, she was Isha. And Isha means that she has the same kind of role and significance as her male counterpart. In addition, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave her the role of mother. Now, if we live in times when women are struggling with the issue of who am I, where am I supposed to use my talents, we may not be able to look in the chinuch of our daughters just to their role as mothers. What happens to the old maid, meaning she's 19 and not married yet? What does she do for the next years of her life? What educational opportunities do we afford young women who want to use their talents? If satisfaction, as some people said before, is important in self-definition, in their quality of motherhood, well, what do we tell the girl who is academically oriented? Do we encourage it, discourage it, because it's going to complement or get in the way of her role as mother? What do we tell the woman who's 23? We have lots of them. That's another, we haven't discussed the shidduch crisis. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women out there who are not in the role of mother, and what exactly is their role? What do we encourage them to do with their time? They're not supposed to become Gedolei Rosh Yeshiva, I think, right? We handled that in the Open Orthodoxy session. So part of what we have to think about is not just the role of motherhood, but what our conception is of the role of the modern Bas Yisrael. And I don't have the foggiest idea.
I think that we had hoped, and I think we will now turn to getting some questions from the community here. Shimon will take over the mic again and will present some of the questions that were provided to him from the community.
Thank you, and thank you for a great discussion so far. So, Rabbi Adlerstein, your prediction was true. I think your opinions are more popular in the Vatican. But I want to start with our moderator, Moshe Bain. So some months ago at a dedication in Lakewood of a building, a noted Gvir a billionaire, got up and said, we need to take a step back for a second and give ourselves some credit. We have tremendous wealth in our community, and we're building tremendous institutions. Look at what we've accomplished. And certainly we have more to go, but we've done a lot. So the question is, they say that it's no problem getting your name on a building, but it's harder to get people to donate toilet paper. Maybe we could put little plaques on them. And we have the amount of wealth, Bli Ayin Hara, in the Frum community is staggering today. There's no shortage of billionaires, and are our Gvirim doing enough for the day-to-day expenses, the pressures that are driving all of us, specifically tuition? Are they doing enough to fulfill their communal obligation?
Well, first of all, I take issue with the fact that there is no shortage of billionaires. I think we could do with a few more, and I offered to volunteer. I want to share a Dvar Torah that was one of the last lessons that Weinberg shared with me at the end of his life. And it goes somewhat to your question, but maybe a little off topic, but it's relevant in any event, to the role of a philanthropist. And we spent some time this afternoon talking about community infrastructure and leadership roles, and one of the topics that I didn't find appropriate to raise there, but in light of your question, I'd like to raise now. And the question is, among the various functions and responsibilities, what is the opportunity and responsibility of a philanthropist? And I had asked Rav Weinberg the following question. Chazal tell us that every individual should be giving as much tzedakah as appropriate, but al yivazvez yoser michomesh. You should not give away more than 20% of your wealth to charity. And I shared with Rav Weinberg my observation that I meet many people who are extraordinarily wealthy, and they don't give away more than 20%, but they really don't need it. And is it really moral for somebody who has excess wealth, while there are people who could benefit from it, that money, and perhaps change, if not often save their lives, by giving it away? So what does Chazal mean? Is it moral when Chazal say, Al yivazvez yosem michomesh? So the first thing that happened was Rav Weinberg slapped me and told me, we don't ask whether Chazal is moral. Chazal is moral. We have to now understand the morality that Chazal is teaching us. And then he went on to tell me one of the most profound lessons that was relevant to a balabas. And he said, the flaw in your question is a misunderstanding of the nisayon that an individual is given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu when wealth is being given to him. The question that I posed, he said to me, is under the assumption that the exclusive responsibility that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is placing on someone who has been blessed with financial success is a decision onto how to distribute or spend the money that he was given. And that's an nisayon. Are you frivolous? Are you indulgent? Or are you generous and thoughtful? But that's incomplete. In reality, money is given to an individual with two independent nisyonos, two independent challenges. On one hand, a wealthy person must decide, in fact, how to spend his money, and what to spend, and what to save, and what to give, and to whom to give. That's one area. But there's a second. And the second is that when a person is granted wealth, they're granted influence. And that influence is an enormous burden and an enormous responsibility. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives someone wealth, that person does not have the right to exempt themselves from that responsibility, which they could do by giving away most of their money. They don't have the right to give away their money because they need to use that as a source of influence. And when Rav Weinberg told me that, which was a remarkable, I had never heard anything close to that before, I shared it with a number of other rabbinic leaders, and each one was, wow, what a chiddush. Wow, I never heard that idea before. And it was really an innovative, sort of like made out of whole cloth idea. And let me share with you an epilogue that took place many years later. I was on the subway on a Friday morning, and I was learning daf, and I heard someone scream. And I looked behind me to see who was screaming, and I realized it was me. And I was trying, well, why did I scream? And I realized I had just read a Gemara in Sukkah. And the Gemara in Sukkah goes through different tragedies that befall an individual and describes the reasons for those tragedies to have occurred. Why someone may suffer an illness, why someone may suffer a death in the family. And then the Gemara says, and why would it be that someone would lose their money? And the Gemara's lashon, the language is, because he could have been mocha and he wasn't. If a person could have been mocha and he wasn't, he's vulnerable to losing his money. What does mocha mean? That he could have rebuked, he could have taken a public stand, and he failed to do so. And Rashi right there says the following: because a person who has wealth has an opportunity to be a mashpia, and if you're not a mashpia, you're going to lose your money. And I said, wow, Weinberg wasn't machadish, it's a beferish Rashi. And all the other rabbis who I was presenting it to just weren't reading the Rashi in practical, applicable terms. So when we talk about the role of the philanthropist and his role as a person to influence the community, I wanted to distinguish between your question, which is a legitimate question on how money should be allocated, but I don't want to lose the opportunity to share with all of us that for those who are put in a position to write a check to a Mossad, it's a responsibility that goes beyond the money itself. And when we talked earlier about leadership, and we talked earlier about making change in the community, that is one of the most significant opportunities that I think is being squandered because people who are given the opportunity to support Mostas and institutions and charities and stuckas and chesed organizations aren't using that influence to extract the kind of efficiency, quality, and priorities that should be pursued. Now, to your question about tuition, there is a little bit of a tension. Because certainly, as Rabbi Hauer noted extensively earlier, and it's clearly part of the Masorah and perhaps even halacha, that an obligation of chinuch is a community obligation rather than an individual, and therefore philanthropy needs to take into acknowledgement that that should be a priority. I don't know that the concern so much is prioritizing. I think there's a concern that, and this is a very interesting observation that I could be very comfortable in sharing with you. I don't find it a tension between whether a charity dollar goes to tuition coverage or whether it goes to other competing interests. But rather, there's an enormous amount. When I say enormous, I literally mean billions of dollars of charity money within the Orthodox community that is not being distributed, that is sitting in charitable foundations, family foundations, and other types of foundations, totally within the control of Orthodox Jews, and is not being distributed. And when we talk about crises, whether it's a tuition crisis or others, the question is why? If there is such a need, and everybody acknowledges that tuitions are destroying the quality of life in the family, and I'll tell you, primarily being involved in the more modern Orthodox community, the tuition crisis is really a distinct crisis in the modern Orthodox community as opposed to the yeshiva community. In the yeshiva community, the tuition crisis is one of shalom bayis and stress levels and how to survive as a family with this added burden that seems to be overwhelming and irreparable. In the modern community, it is that, but it's also a religious issue. Because you could now walk into Great Neck High School in New York and you'll find about 25 yarmulkes. And you could go to Lawrence High School and you find every year an additional number of yarmulkes because parents are simply sending their children to public school because they're not prepared to impinge on their lifestyle or make the sacrifices that are necessary to send their children to yeshiva. So it's a real issue. The question then is, why aren't people giving away these billions of dollars? And there could be many explanations, but let me share with you one of them, because it relates to the schools themselves. You find in economic analysis a direct correlation between the degree of investment dollars and the great degree of regulation within a society. And the countries around the globe that have heightened securities and financial regulation have heightened investment. Because people are much more prepared to invest in a business that they're comfortable, they're being told what's going on in the business. By contrast, if you live in a country which has very low securities financial regulations, people are very scared. I don't really know what I'm investing in. And the same is true with stucco dollars. In institutions that are transparent, that people are able to understand where their money is going, how it's being spent, the degree of efficiency, the degree of responsibility, people are much more willing to invest as a stucco dollar investment. And we have a culture within the Orthodox community, and in the right-wing community in particular, of an enormous lack of transparency. And institutions are incredibly controlling of the information flow. And when you go to a philanthropist and expect them to give the kinds of money you want and are suggesting is appropriate and is appropriate, there has to be a two-way street. And the Mosdas themselves need to create an environment in which the encouragement of these kinds of investments is reasonable and has a legitimate expectation. So to go to your fundamental question, it's true. We need to encourage greater philanthropy on the more basic dimensions of Jewish life, which at far most important is fundamental Jewish education. But by the same token, the Mosdas need to assume a greater degree of responsibility for transparency to allow for that expectation to ever be realized.
Next question is for Rabbi Adlerstein, there seems to be a wave of protest in the audience from your Eretz Yisrael comments. So the idea that somehow there's less economic pressure or it's easier to make it in Eretz Yisrael seems to have perplexed some of us here. Just on my way out tonight to get here, I bumped into the car with a bunch of Mishalachim from Eretz Yisrael who are collecting for their own children. And, the poverty that we see there, one of the issues that we've spoken about over Shabbos is the extraordinary poverty, especially in the Haredi community, the challenges of making a living there. So, and one person actually noted that what you can get from Eretz Yisrael for $500,000 is a tiny two-bedroom apartment. I mean, maybe in Gaza it's cheaper. But so what are you saying when you're talking about the great economic or opportunity or?
Well, since I live in Israel, I'll answer that question very quickly.
But you work in America.
I assume, and I think we discussed it briefly, Rabbi Yitzhak was talking about if you have a transferable skill to go to Eretz Yisrael, if you have advanced computer skills, for instance, then it's quite clear that financially you'll be better off in Israel because you will have minimal tuitions, you'll have minimal health insurance costs, you've knocked off two of the major expenses that every family faces. He wasn't talking if you want to live in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to Eretz Yisrael to learn. He was talking about, and even then you would have those costs cut off if you don't have New Jersey care or whatever. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a free ride in Israel, it's going to be easy, and there are all kinds of other problems. But financially, if you have some marketable skill that the Israeli economy has a place for, then you are potentially in a lot better shape for that very simple reason. Is that right?
Yeah, that's part of it. Another part is that even if we're not talking about us making aliyah, although I hope we all zocha to it and looking ahead at the future, the Haredi community in Israel is very, very much in transition. Jonathan and I sat this summer at Tikva. We heard someone who said that the current population, Haredi population in higher education institutions in Yerushalayim is now up to 10%. Not a figure I would have thought of. There are thousands and thousands of people who've made it into the workforce. For reasons I still don't understand, the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel claims that for the first time, Haredi employment is over 50%. I'm not sure exactly what that includes. There are more programs in Eretz Yisrael today for someone who has, let's say, minimal general studies education, but now wants to transition into the Israeli workforce, into Israeli academia. There are Kickstart programs where in the space of a year and a half you can get the equivalent of Bagrut. Virtually every university in Israel that I'm aware of now has programs that are specifically tailor-made, usually gender segregated, for Haredim, where frankly, it's probably easier for somebody who's motivated, which is not everybody, but somebody from the community who's motivated to want to become a professional in STEM, that's not one of the options that they offer you in the special programs in Lakewood. STEM is where the jobs are. And in Israel today, you can come from the Haredi community, and if you want to, you can get into a program that's going to give you a job in computers or engineering. So I believe that, yes, the forecast is much better for Eretz Yisrael than for here. I'm going to stand by that.
Are there tangible steps, just a couple? I mean, I got the impression that you were also talking about leading our kids there, that things are okay now, but the next generation it's going to be even harder. Are there a few tangible steps that if we say we want our kids to succeed, and part of that success is that they'd be better in Eretz Yisrael, regardless of the hashkafic issues and driving forces there, but to give them that will allow them to move there? A couple of things that you would recommend that's open to Jonathan or Rabbi Anderson.
Well, one is that for those of us, and I don't know what the percentage is in this room, for those of us who have children who actually have professional and academic leanings and are going to act on them, that we not make the mistake that many of us are making here and just say, hey, that's an interesting program, and, go for it. That you have to look at where the jobs are. And the jobs are in certain areas. And if your children are looking for areas to train, keep in mind there's a possibility, at least leave the door open for those jobs that are in higher demand, or can be, at least b'derech hateva, can be forecast to be in higher demand in Eretz Yisrael. There are areas that are in demand in Israel and not so much in demand here. Jerusalem College of Technology, known to some of us as, back in the old days, as Professor Lev, just started a program for male Haredi nurses. There's a real tzarech for that. There's a real need for that in the community. And they're stepping up to it. JCT itself has over 10 different programs for Haredim in Israel. Take the time to investigate what's out there, where the economy is going, what the economy is going to look like, but as much as we can predict b'derech hateva, and factor that into the training of your children.
This next question is for Rabbi Hauer. So we've talked a lot over Shabbos and tonight about the changing role of women, and perhaps 100 years ago, if you've asked our Gedolim if they would envision what our wives and daughters are doing today and the role that they play, they would have been shocked and probably pushed back against it. So clearly there are certain groups that we've talked about that are pushing the boundaries beyond what's acceptable, but is there perhaps room for an increased role of women within Avodas HaKodesh, within Shul, in any way different than what it is today, to reflect the changing roles in the house and outside as well?
Another easy one. Is there room for change in the Avodas HaKodesh of women within the shul, etc.?
A different shul.
This is really something we should tackle in 3 minutes. But I'll try to address it directly, quickly, and hopefully to some degree meaningfully. I think this is something which has to be evaluated seriously. I'm spending some meaningful time on my own thinking about that. I've spoken to one of my dear friends here on this panel to some extent about this issue. I don't feel that there's any room for any change in ritual whatsoever. I think the old recipe of ritual is absolutely perfect, and we haven't made changes. No imagined changes of the past. But I think that there's an issue of service, of, the rabbinate today is very partially a ritual position. A lot of what is performed by a rabbi today is social and support, and I think that many, many times women will benefit from the social support and the help which will come not from a man but from a woman. I don't think that that is something which therefore creates a new role called a female rabbi. I do think that it creates a consciousness and an awareness that women need people to speak to with a level of comfort that they won't be able to speak to a man with. You know, Chazal tell us that, the Pasuk says, I think it's in the Navi Hosea, where it refers to the three leaders of the Jewish people, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. And the Targum says that Miriam was the leader of the Jewish women. And we have that. We have leaders of Jewish women who are sitting here. They have never sought any kind of a different title than whatever their natural titles are, and I don't see any room or need for a change for that. But I do see the value of having a stronger cadre of women who would be able to be identifiably reached out to by women who seek direction, sometimes seeking direction in sensitive matters. I, like all Rabbanim in the community, try to make myself as sensitively available for women for questions of Taras HaMishpacha as I possibly can, to preserve anonymity, to do everything in a sensitive manner, to enable a husband to be a go-between if he so wish. But I can't imagine for a second that there aren't many, many women who would be hesitant to bring their questions. These are very private questions, they're very personal questions. And if they would be able to access someone who could serve as a go-between, as a help, I think that's something that would make a difference in people's lives. So I think that it's something that we have to think about. I think as well that we would be blind to think about making such changes without an awareness of the context of what's going on around us. I think some of the well-meaning and well-modulated changes that certain people designed may have been oblivious to the wave which we have going on around us, which I think is a frightening wave. And so I don't plan on making any decisions anytime real soon about this. I think, as Rabbi Adlerstein said before, this is an area with which we have to dedicate a lot of thought and not assume that everything should be the same. But we must do it with an awareness of the holiness and constancy of the ritual formula for the Jewish people, and at the same time a keen awareness that these questions are not just occurring in a vacuum, and balance things just right.
Just a question for Rabbi Lopiansky. Can Rosh Yeshiva perhaps maybe elucidate a couple of items that our schools, our high schools especially, can do to maybe, unless they already are doing them, to better prepare our children for the roles and responsibilities that they'll have to play, both physically balancing everything that's going on in today's world and spiritually as well. We talked a little bit last night about the role of Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael and that gap year and the family, but is there any, are the yeshivas doing enough? Can they do more? What can they do?
Well, first of all, there are a wide range of yeshivas, and like we said last night, the only perfect one's Yeshiva Greater Washington. Applications are in the back if you so wish.
Outside of that area?
I think there are two points to make about it. First is understanding the big difference between a teenager and an adult. All your parents don't need to know this. You've all experienced it. The type of discussion we have now seems to be keeping adult people up late at night. I don't think many teenagers would find this type of discussion extremely exciting. They like something more passionate, one-sided, one-minded, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big difference in the age. the years of a teenager, and the Chazon Ish actually points to this. The Chazon Ish has, someone wrote to him about, I guess, introducing secular studies and things like that. You don't get the context, you don't have the question, you just have his reply. And he writes something about the lahat haneurim that has to be in Torah. In other words, a teenager is not about balancing things in life, it's about finding the inner fire and ideal and cause and so on. You hope that, God forbid, his education doesn't stop at 18, because then all you have is a hot teenager. When he gets older, things begin to settle, and he takes that inner core of passion and sort of it begins to give it shape and form, and hopefully it's sort of a mature, balanced picture. So I do think one of our problems is, and this has to do with the Haredi gap year in Eretz Yisrael, is most boys spend 2 or 3 years in yeshiva here, and they come to Eretz Yisrael, let's say by the time they're 20, which is for us, I guess, the still end of teenage years. And they come back, they don't have a Rebbe. So they don't have anyone to help them with the next stage of life. So the job of a Rebbe in that era is to bring out the fire and the rah-rah-rah, so if you're a Zionist school, it's Zionism, if you're a Haredi school, it's Torah, if it's a Chassidish school, it's Dveikus. But I once heard a shmooze from the Belzer Rebbe on a tape. I'm giving away the dates. Yeah, they still have tapes. They still have tapes there. And he seems very practical. And he said, a Bucher came to me, and he says, Bucher, they have these fantasies that sometimes want to make you laugh, but I held myself. A Bucher was struggling. Should he become like the Chazon Ish or like Reb Arla Belza? Reb Arla Belza was an off-the-charts Kaddish, the Chazon Ish and that. And the Rebbe said, I chuckled inside, but I kept my calm. Understand, high schools need to see themselves as part of a picture. We're not doing enough in the next stage, where we need to make the transition to help people sort of give real flesh and bones to their ideals. That's one. Secondly, it comes back again to, we spoke Friday night a bit about it, the aspect of it's another piece of education is providing guidance. It's not a classroom, and we need to find exact frameworks fit. It's a late discussion, it's a group discussion, it's a kumsitz, it's a summer, it's a this, it's a that. And it's not easy. A high school is run very, very, by the clock and courses and grades. And, if a Rebbe, he may need to take a part of the kids. So I think the struggle in the schools is to find an extra school vehicle as somewhere part of the broader curriculum to bring some of these points home.
Okay, want to just finish off by asking each one of the panelists if there's, this has been a beautiful Shabbos, and we've had a lot of discussions, but is there something that we should be taking away? What should we walk away with? And I guess we'll start with Maishbein.
I suspect that everybody will have a comment or an answer or an idea that speaks to them, and I suspect it'll vary dramatically from person to person. But by the same token, I think there is one central theme that everybody should walk away with, in my opinion, and that is that we're a community, and the issues that we confront are pretty uniform among us. And that, in one sense, is a tremendous comfort, but the even greater comfort is that we're concerned about these issues. And there are problems, but there are much greater celebrations than the problems that we discussed. And the fact that we're able to get together and celebrate the holiness of our community, the health of our community, while simultaneously identifying issues, concerns, and improvements that we could entertain, I think is an enormous chizuk for us to deal with the issues that we have to deal with.
I agree I agree wholeheartedly with Rav Moshe. I would add that, just 2 things. One is what used to be, I think, the slogan around IBM, which is think. Right? Remember those days? That was what they had on their pads and everywhere else. Think. what we've engaged in over the past couple of days, this special opportunity with some really, really special people, is thinking about our situation and not just going ahead with it. And whether it's with broad issues or very, very simple issues, I would call attention, and this we don't make sales or make money from anything, but we recently published the most recent issue of Klal Perspectives on technology. And it's wonderful. It's really, really a very, very special issue. And it's an issue which all of us have to grapple with. It's changing our lives by the minute. And here's an opportunity to sit and to read one article a week and to think about its ramifications and to do something about it. Life is too precious, and the opportunities which we have before us as we're willing to just keep going because it's there. And the opportunity which we've had here to engage thoughtfully is one which is very, very precious and serious, engage thoughtfully in serious matters. We're not changing the world. We don't endeavor to, but for each of us to endeavor to do that for ourselves and for our families is extremely valuable, and I hope and pray that we will be able to continue to provide a forum for those kinds of things, both in writing and in person. I would also say another takeaway from this is that I think we have to do this again. But I think that the next time that we do this, I would like, rather than having a general discussion about 3 different issues, I would like us to have something we have talked about in the past, where we choose a very specific issue and bring people beyond these great people to my left and to my right, but people who themselves how can you not love this guy? People who would be the experts in that specific area or the practitioners in that specific area, and to actually think and talk tachlis, and to spend hour after hour trying to move forward in tachlis to see maybe there's something that we can actually do.
Jonathan, if you could just highlight for us something that we can take away from this Shabbos.
Yeah, I heard the question. That's not why I ran out. In any event, to tell you the truth, I don't think I would presume to try and summarize complex discussions that went in many different directions. I just want to follow up on something that Rabbi Howard said, the ability to think. The word lihisponen, I think, appears more than any other word in Mesilas Yesharim. It's the ability to contemplate. Rabbi Yerucham already said in 1932 that to find a person of depth, to find a contemplative person, is almost unheard of. It's a quality that it seems counterintuitive that in this high-tech, no reading, multiple messages coming through all the time that will cultivate that quality, but we have to do it. I'd like to return to something I said last night, that there are educational messages which I don't believe are getting through sufficiently. Last night I talked about Kiddush Hashem, that a person finds themselves within their individual role, that in this area, everybody's equal in their ability to make a Kiddush Hashem in the world, and if we talked about it, with respect to our specific topic, and I think Rav Lopiansky already mentioned it, somebody once came to the Kelm, the Beis Talmud of Kelm, and they heard what they considered to be, the altar must be giving a hesped. He was crying, and he was so emotional, they thought it must be a hesped. It turned out that the occasion of his impassioned oratory was that somebody had come into the vestibule and left their boots not pointed in the same direction together. One thing I find, the older I get, and since time management is not my specialty, I find that people who cultivate the quality of order, seder, who learn how to plan a day at the beginning, learn the things where they're going to get trapped, how much time they'll end up spending on the internet, all these forms of seder are absolutely essential, setting priorities and so forth, And some of this is done at a younger age. It has to be done both in the home and in the schools, but it can be done. Daniel Frank, who's a graduate of Ner Yisrael and a friend of mine, used to have a course in Muncie where he worked on things, setting priorities, self-knowledge. I mean, how are we, with Rabbi Hauer's brilliant afterword, that you don't have to do it all, but if you want to know what you should be doing, you have to know how to think about yourself. We're not teaching our kids that the importance of thinking, to understand who they are, to understand themselves, how do you go about thinking about yourself? These are parts, education, I don't just mean it's the school's responsibility. I mean, it's the chinuch responsibility to develop some of these qualities, to be thinking more deeply about what are the messages that we're conveying within our educational system. And that's just one area I'd like to focus attention on.
I'm going to pick up with Rabbi Hauer's suggestion of using slogans. If you haven't figured out, Rabbi Hauer's the one 2 seats to the right. And just basically thank the Olam. We've spent a good couple of years and a lot of time on Klal Perspectives. It was born out of a hunch that the frustration that some of us were feeling could be turned to positive advantage if we brought to the tzibur all of the issues that were troubling us and saying, hey, this is for all of us, and there's diversity in the community, there's diversity of thought. We'll give chizuk just by showing that there can be different opinions sitting around one table, of people who can speak civilly to each other and still be united as B'nai Torah. But it's been a lot of work. We spent a lot of time on this. We get paid very, very, very little, like zero. It's been worth it from the reaction that we've gotten from you. This has been a way of validating years and years of work. The receptivity, the warmth that we feel in this room is the chizuk that you've given us and will continue to give us as we plow ahead with Klal Perspectives. Thank you.
Rabbi Lopiansky.
I guess I'd like to reiterate 2 of the points that I made that I think should be main points for us. The first one is what I said over for Aveinemer, and that is, when somebody came and complained and said, why don't they do this, they do this, they do this, and he said, who's the they, and then he said, when the we become the they will do what we understand should be done. These type of things it's so easy. It feeds into our wrong emotional responses by we blame this, the education system, that system, and the other thing. The only thing HaKadosh Baruch Hu will hold us accountable for is us, ourselves. And if somebody's here tonight or last night, whether he's sitting in the audience on the panel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu means him to do something that he can do. And the question is, what can I do? And so whenever we deal with all these issues, instead of it being a convenient way to blame someone else for our ills, the question is, what do we need to do? Secondly, and it's my perspective, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like he made different people, every generation, and it says this in the Tanya, he's already holding my Chaf Bezing as Kodesh, this is in the Tanya in Aleph, that it's every generation has, each person is like part of a big person, and all generations are slices of a huge, what he calls Komas Adam. There's a reason why 60 years ago, keeping Shabbos was a terrible nisayon. It's not we became tzaddikim today, but that was the nisayon of that generation. There was a nisayon where anyone who went to university became an apikoris because somehow you didn't have any answers, it wasn't compatible, the answers, that. Today, you can just go on blog. You don't have to go to university to become an apikoris. It's easy. But our generation, so yes, the lamenting about how terrible Nisyonis are really are meaningless. The question, the framework has to be is, what is the unique Nisyon of our generation? It'll always be unique. Every generation is not going to redo what the other generation did. We have our challenges. We have what it takes to meet it. We have the good to take out of everything and the stuff that we have to stand and discard. Many ideas in history were when we look at idols and we laugh at it, once upon a time, that was the most sophisticated way of looking at life, and a God idea seemed to be crazy. There are many ideas that now float up to the surface that seem so contemporary, and if we know it's wrong, then we have to stick by our guns. And yet we also have to understand where do we have to go the next step to meet these challenges. So instead of thinking as problems that beset us, this is our Avodas Hashem. It's our Avodas Hashem generation. It's our Avodas Hashem is each and every single person who comprises this generation.
I think somebody started off and said Paischen b'chvei achsanya, and they really did a job on it. I would like to do the corollary, which is to be chaysem b'chvei ha'archim. I would like to close tonight and close this weekend, close this Shabbos, with honor for our wonderful, wonderful guests. We, Baruch Hashem, are very, very good friends. We sat together. We have often serious and sometimes difficult discussions, but we all had a goal, and the goal was that this weekend should enhance Kiddush Hashem, should be an exercise in positive exploration of possibilities, of growth, and this remarkable group of people, I think they're Gedolim by some definition. But this remarkable group of people have really helped and brought us up. Az nidbru yirei Hashem ish oreu vayakshiv Hashem vayishma vayikosev sefer zikaron lefanav. We hope that together, Baruch Hashem, all of us have engaged in this process wonderfully to try to grow, to make ourselves better. We hope it will only grow. I want to express a thank you, an individual thank you to Rabbi Lopiansky, the Rosh Yeshiva, for all that he has brought to us this Shabbos and his unique flavor, the Rosh Yeshiva. I want to express gratitude to Rav Yitzchak Adlerstein for everything which he does all the time and for the fresh and serious and challenging insights which he brought to the table here. I want to express gratitude to Jonathan Rosenblum, who came all the way from Eretz Yisrael and who always has so much to add to the conversation from the lives that he studied and from his own personal insights and keen observations. And I want to express appreciation to my dear friend Rav Moshe Bain, whose incredible avodas hakodesh for the Jewish community. In some conversation or exchange of emails a couple of days ago, he said, "Look, I do a moment here and a moment there of avodas hakodesh," and I think it was a typo. I think he does a moment here and a moment there of legal work, just your insight and what you've shared with everybody here has been so wonderful, so impactful. I'm grateful that you allowed our Kehillah to benefit from it, and I thank you very much. And Be'ez Hashem, we should go onward and upward. Lahagdil Torah Ulahadira.